Good morning from Northern California, where we have yellow skies and ash floating down on us from fires just a couple of hours away by car. It's been a somewhat stressful summer with California fires, but we are safe, and you can see out our backyard why we're constantly on the being diligent about whether fires are in our area or not. But anyway, this morning, this video is prompted by several participants who commented that their breakout groups, while interesting, and they were meeting very interesting people, seemed to jump all over the place, and that the conversations had some waste in it and some confusion because there wasn't enough context. Many of you know the Vantage Point model, and those who don't will probably recognize it pretty easily as a set of, from philosophical down to the task, areas of thought, and that often somebody is talking philosophical and somebody else jumps in with the logistics, and that makes it confusing in terms of what are we talking about, how do we distinguish, where are we? And so that's the purpose for this short video.
Yeah, it's a good thing, and we're going to focus on Vantage Points, but I will remind you that the design formation model is also a good companion to this. An example in my field, let's say years ago when I was doing architecture, I was presenting to a group a building, and everyone's sitting there from across the whole corporation, and I pull out the drawing and say about 5 or 6 things, and the chief financial officer says, "What's this going to cost?" And what I have is a preliminary design.
Speak up.
And so the only thing that I could say, we don't know. And he said, "Well," and gets all upset. And I said, "We know that it's within this range because buildings like this at this place and time are costing about that. But until we get down into engineering, working drawings, and able to do rigorous pricing, we will not know the cost. There's no way to know the cost." And you can see that the conversation, I'm coming from a preliminary vantage point, not vantage point, a preliminary design formation, and I'm coming from a early vantage point of the philosophy and the purpose and what the design is supposed to be doing according to the conditions we were given. And the chief financial officer is not being a jerk, but his job is to know what are things going to cost and how do we afford it and how do we pay for it. It's just that those two conversations cannot take place at that moment in that way.
So, so when we are looking at our conversations and asking each other questions about our stances and stands, it's really important that we listen and pause and ask each other questions about, do you mean, and what vantage point are you speaking from? And I think that that will make the conversations a lot easier. I wanted to bring up one other thing, that up creation is all about the transformation and moving from one paradigm to another. And Thomas Kuhn, back in the 70s, when he wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, mentioned that during paradigm shifts that you can use one word and both sides take it differently. That it means something to those in the existing paradigm, and those speaking new paradigm who haven't created their language yet are at odds with each other and don't even know it, because they're both using the word vision, or they're both using the word similar words that they think are expressing a story or a concept, when in fact they're being heard completely different. So there's a lot of checking and asking and taking the time in these conversations to to practice speaking to each other, hearing each other, and organizing thoughts along the different vantage points.
Yeah, in the models book, there's a long section called Terms of Art. And the reason why there's a long section of Terms of Art is saying if you're reading these models as they are written at this time, this is what these words mean. It doesn't mean that this is the definition and the only legitimate use of those words. It just is an attempt to get the words defined so that whether you agree or disagree, you at least know the basis by which you are having that conversation. So in Gilbert's model, he started off with philosophy and moved, to culture and down to strategy and logistics and so on. And we added one. He didn't put task. He got all the way down, but he didn't put task. And task itself has its own language and its own nuance and meanings of words. But it was a pretty brilliant thing that he did at the time. And, his observation was, he worked with very large companies, is that people were just talking past one another.
Yeah, Margaret Wheatley in her book, Science and the New, I've forgotten the name of the book, Science and the New something, by Meg Wheatley.
There's only one, it's
Right.
a new something.
Right. Didn't use vantage points exactly, but she talks about how when you're walking down the street, a shopping street, and you're suddenly drawn into a store, she said, that you can feel the philosophy all the way down to the store clerk are in alignment. And you walk in and you just feel like there's authenticity, there's integrity, there's value here. And she said you walk into other stores and you know that there's not this coherent form that an organization, a small business or whatever has put forth in terms of their philosophy and their culture. What's the culture from the philosophy? What are the policies then that support the culture and the philosophy?
Mm-hmm.
Then what is the strategy if we have our policies thought through and our culture and our philosophy? Then what are the strategies? Then you get to tactics and logistics and, of course, the art of doing, which is doing the task, the transmission of one step to another step. And I have put the Tomorrow Maker's Vantage Point model on my circle, my circle in Miro. So you can go and see that as a sample as well.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about Wheatley's observation, and it's really true, and when you just pay attention to how you respond, because you could do this unconsciously, and which is basically that kind of response generally is. But you pay attention to it because it illustrates some important design principles. We say when we talk about making environments for our work, everything speaks, and everything does speak, and everywhere you go, everything speaks, and that's one of the biggest driving factors of design, and why it's important that things express what they are and to have integrity. If someone built you a very economical and nice little car and put a body on it like an Italian racing car, that would be a contradiction in terms, because the car would be telling you it's just out there to go as fast as anything in the world, but in fact it's really to be the most efficient and inexpensive thing in the world. And so how these things match. Language, when we speak to one another, the words we choose, the way that we give it meaning and gesture should be congruent so that the other person can actually grasp what it is that we're actually saying. And so motion, pace, tone of voice, being on a vantage point that you're consistent with. And of course, the conversation in your breakouts will move. They'll start philosophically and stuff like that, and then they'll get down, hopefully, to task that you're there to accomplish. And a warning there: if you're supposed to come out with a task, don't try starting with a task and task language. You have to put a context around it, or the task is meaningless without that context. So play that model. It doesn't take longer, but know where you are. Ask people, well, what's your perspective here? You know, are you coming from a philosophical point of view, or are you saying that we really ought to do this on a daily basis? And then after a little while, you'll calibrate, and then the work will be much more fun and much more productive.
Gilbert has some fun chapters in this book. He has characters, and those characters at a dinner conversation get in a terrible jam, an argument with each other, because they're speaking from many different vantage points and trying to have a dinner conversation, family dinner conversation, and of course everybody wants to walk away from the table and in frustration. And then he starts why that happened, and he goes back and shares the vantage point each person was talking from and why it got so confusing, and how one thing can just set off a whole conversation on another track, which isn't always bad. It's not saying that that's bad. It's saying, but perhaps if you step up to the facilitator of this group, you're stepping up to helping everybody learn to practice and to speak from these different vantage points, and to stay on point, or if you wander, to agree that this wandering is worthy and acceptable. So this next session that is coming up, number 4, this is a tool for you to use to see if you can have your conversations more coherent, more exciting, less kind of stumbling around to find your voice.
Yeah, one last little caution, because Gail really put her finger on it, but I want to kind of emphasize it. Just because you know you want to end up at one vantage point, don't try to force into it. And sometimes a deviation from another vantage point is actually going to be very productive. The important thing is to know what vantage point you're on, and to know what vantage point your other participants and collaborators are on, and then watch it so that you know when to start to bring it to the vantage point that you have been tasked to accomplish. And sometimes it's not just coming from philosophy down to task. Often you're given a philosophical or a cultural issue, and people sort of jump right into task. Well, in my organization, we do this. And there's no opportunity there then to get it up into the vantage point that, in fact, you have been charged to look at.
Right. Okay, so we will practice this during our next new moon, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah, and if you actually see us, that fire back there didn't get here.
All right. Goodbye.